Hi, everyone. Welcome to A Closer Look. In this segment, we're going to talk through a Synergistic Mindsets Intervention. This is an intervention that combines the concept of growth mindset with the concept of stress can be enhancing mindset.
And so we've already covered the growth mindset in a separate episode. We're going to start with a conversation with Ali Crum, one of the scientific originators of the theory behind the stress can be enhancing mindset, learn a little bit about what she sees as sort of the key elements of this intervention and what makes it powerful. And then we'll walk through the materials from the Synergistic Mindsets Intervention, which combines growth mindset with stress can be enhancing mindset, and do what we always do and talk through the thinking behind all of the design decisions that we think are significant.
Yeah, and this is a good one to do the walkthrough because you might think that if you've got effective intervention A and effective intervention B, then all you have to do is put them together like Legos. But in fact, it's more like baking. They really need to be pulled together in ways where the two mindsets are synergistic.
All right, and so we've got Ali Crum with us now from Stanford University. Ali is one of the scientific creators of the theory behind the stress can be enhancing mindset. Welcome, Ali. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, so great to be here.
So I guess sort of the first thing I'd love to get your take on, as sort of the one of the big creative forces behind this intervention is, what do you think of as the key concepts that need to be communicated in an effective stress can be enhancing mindset intervention in order for it to have the intended effect?
Yeah, so there's several key content. There's a lot of key content in this work. The first, obviously, is information demonstrating, supporting the fact that stress can be enhancing. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how to describe that information in a way that participants really get and trust. One of the unique things about this intervention, however, is that it's metacognitive in the sense that we don't only prescribe, or we don't only share with them information that stress is enhancing, but we also kind of tell them that, hey, the true nature of stress is a paradox. It's complicated. The true nature of stress is that it can be debilitating or it can be enhancing. And what we suggest in the intervention is that one of the things that can distinguish whether or not stress will be debilitating or enhancing is a person's mindset about it. So this intervention that we've designed is metacognitive in the sense that we teach them about mindsets. And our goal is to really motivate them to adopt the stress is enhancing mindset because it is useful, not necessarily because it's more true than, say, the stress is debilitating mindset. So the key really here is to give them information on the complete nature of stress, to really orient them to the power that the evidence that suggests that stress can be enhancing, because that's often not given in our modern society. Then to showcase the power of mindset. And then the last piece of our intervention is we provide them with a 3-step approach to adopt a stress is enhancing mindset consciously and deliberately. So acknowledging their stress, welcoming their stress as something that they care about, and then utilizing the stress response to activate or channel into the things they really care about. So there's a lot of subtleties in there that are key to really pay attention to.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, and it strikes me as a little bit different from the approach that we've seen in some of the other interventions, because you're not taking a strong position on the right way to think. It feels more like you're empowering the participant to choose how they're going to think about their stress. Does that sound like a reasonable characterization?
That's exactly right. We're not trying to convince them of a mindset because it's true, but to motivate them to adopt a mindset because it's useful. And this was really necessary in this context, with Carol's original growth mindset interventions, the evidence was so strong that our brains can change, we can grow, our personalities can change, and so forth. That it wasn't, it made a lot of sense to just say, hey, this is the truth, right? This is the reality. And knowing that mindset is useful. When it comes to stress, the evidence is not so clear cut. The evidence is way more convoluted and complex and paradoxical and really kind of hypocritical in some cases. And so we felt like it was not going to be very ethical to try to just convince people that stress was only enhancing and not really give them the whole picture.
Great. Okay. And so what do you think then end up being the most important ways in which this intervention changes how people think about the stress in their lives, that help this intervention to improve their lives, to improve how they deal with stress when they face it?
Yeah, I mean, as you know from other mindset interventions, when you change the mindset about something, the whole game changes. So, in the context of stress mindset, we think that there are really four mechanisms at play. So, when you shift from a stress is debilitating mindset to a stress is enhancing mindset, four things change. First is that your attention changes. So, what you pay attention to and notice changes. So when you're, feeling like stress is debilitating, you might notice all the ways in which stress is making you sick or tired or kind of crumble at peak moments and so forth. But if you start to view stress as enhancing, you might notice, oh, wow, there are the times that I really rose to the occasion. This is really getting me focused and energized to meet the stress at hand. The second thing that it affects is your affect or emotion. So what we've seen in our research is that when people have a stress is debilitating mindset, not only are they stressed, they're also now stressed about the stress because the stress they're experiencing is now going to kill them, in the stress is debilitating mindset. And so you have sort of like a layer of stress and negative emotions packed on top of the experience of stress to begin with. When you shift to a stress is enhancing mindset, it doesn't make the stressor go away. You might still feel stressed or you might still be struggling, but it relieves some of that worry and negative associations around that stress. And it also might beget some positive emotions like a feeling of self-confidence or motivation or connection or, authenticity. And so emotion can change when we change our mindsets about stress. The third piece, and this is consistent with other mindset interventions, is that your motivation changes. When you change your mindset about stress, your goals and motivation change accordingly. So when you believe that stress is debilitating, what is the goal? It's either to get rid of the stress or to do everything you can to not make stress, to keep stress from being debilitating. It sort of lends itself to either freaking out or checking out. And when you shift to a stress is enhancing mindset, the motivation becomes not to avoid or counteract stress, but actually to utilize stress, to approach it, to welcome it in as something that's connected to the things we care about. And then the last piece that we're starting to uncover is that this mindset shift can change our physiology. And by and large, it's connected to that sort of motivation. So if you're in freaking out mode or checking out mode, you either have hyper or hypo-reactive cortisol levels. But when you can get into a stress is enhancing mindset, that leads to a more moderate cortisol response. And we've also seen some evidence for increased growth promoting hormones like DHEA and other anabolic hormones. So yeah, here again, like the other mindsets, you change your core assumption about something and the whole game changes. What you're paying attention to, how you feel, what you're motivated to do, and potentially what your bodies are prepared to do.
All right, that's fantastic. One thing that I think I want to highlight here is that the stress can be enhancing mindset intervention that you have developed actually takes a little bit of a different sort of, it focuses at a different level of sort of time course, right? So your stress can be enhancing mindset addresses the stress we experience day in, day out over extended periods in our lives in a way that's quite different from the stress component of the Synergistic Mindsets Intervention that we'll talk about later, which focuses on a single discrete event and the sort of sympathetic nervous system activation that kicks in response to that single discrete instance of stress. I'd love to just hear a little bit of your thinking about what the sort of advantages and disadvantages or sort of different aspects that kind of arise from that broader time focus that you adopt in your intervention.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So it's maybe distinction in time course, but it's also, at least it's distinct from, threat, challenge, appraisal interventions also in terms of the level of abstraction, so it's not, it's very similar, but it's also meaningfully different, right? So if you're changing your appraisal of arousal when you're under stress as something that's threatening or or challenging, something that can enhance you, that's about the stressor or the experience of stress in that moment. What we're really focused on in our intervention is your mindset about the nature of stress in general. So not the stressor you're experiencing, not your physiological reaction to it, but just the broader nature of the experience of stress, whether that be something as acute as taking an exam or something as chronic as, undergoing, a cancer diagnosis or dealing with systemic poverty, right? These are very chronic stressors,
Right.
but you could still have a different mindset about stress within each of those.
Yeah, so one of the things that I kind of at least imagine your broader time focus accomplishing that the sort of more discrete threat versus challenge appraisal intervention approach that we'll talk about a little bit later is your intervention, because of that broader time focus, has something to say about how we process or deal emotionally with just sort of the overall level of demand on us day in, day out, right? And that's just not really addressed by a sort of a more specific focus on a discrete event. And so I think, like, I just wonder, sort of, does that sound right to you? Is that a big part of what you were talking about when you mentioned the change in emotional responses, right? You talked about this idea that you could have you could be stressed about having stress, and then that piles a bunch of negative emotion on top of the demand, which can not only make it feel worse because of the negative emotion, but also probably color your experience of the stress in ways that make it a much more negative experience.
Yeah.
Was that sort of core to your thinking? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think what was core to my thinking originally was thinking about when you're deploying an intervention. And I love the very time specific interventions, that you all, Jeremy Jameson and others have done, sort of right before an acute stressor. But there are times where you need, you're going to experience a lot of stressors, right? You can think about, students going into their freshman year, for example. There's going to be not just exams, but maybe interpersonal stressors, maybe, personal challenges that they experience. So there's just going to be a whole host of stressors that they'll experience over that year. Or you think about, soldiers going off on deployment. They might not be stressed, when they're, leaving, and they might not even know what they're going to face, whether it'll be, highly arousing acute stressor, or whether it will be the stress of just boredom and impending doom. So our goal was really to design a mindset intervention that could alter somebody's more abstract or global mindset about stress that could potentially serve them at any moment when they experienced a stressor. And whether that stressor was very acute and challenging, or even more chronic, even threatening. So there are benefits and detriments to all the different approaches. I think ours is maybe so vague that it might not be as impactful in the moment when you could really use a more focused intervention, but it might have a wider net, to sort of
Yeah.
catch and improve someone's response throughout multiple different time points as they're living their lives.
Yeah, that that was a great way to put that. I think you just kind of articulated what I was trying to articulate in my question better than I did in the question. Because I think now that I've heard you say that, I can kind of articulate it better. What I was thinking is that one wonderful thing about your intervention is that I think it helps people not only with sort of optimizing their response in those moments of acute stress, but also it helps them to process their feelings and thoughts about the fact that they might be under a relatively heavy kind of chronic load of stress during an extended period in ways that might result in better mental health.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you think about something like getting a PhD, for example, or getting a degree, or start doing a startup, right? It's not, these are stressors that endure over time.
Yeah.
Right? And at some level we need to, our goal, what I saw as the real possibility here was to sort of, yeah, if you can just tweak that abstract notion of what the experience of stress is, that you could really color and change an entire experience of something that's challenging.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a powerful thing because, as you point out when you write about this, we have such a strong cultural norm around the idea that if you have a lot of demands on you, that's a bad thing, right? If you're busy, if you're trying to accomplish a lot of things, and if you're busy and under a lot of demand, that's a negative thing, a thing to be avoided. And I think one of the important points that gets made, thanks to sort of the work you've done and the writing you've done about that work, is that that's not the only way to think about it. Having a lot of demands on you is very often what you want. If you have big goals you want to accomplish, that inherently comes with a lot of demands on you, and that can be a really exciting thing. It can be a really thrilling period of your life during which you experience enormous personal development. I mean, you mentioned getting a PhD. Graduate school probably was the single most rapid period of personal development in my life, and I think that's true of a lot of people. And it was one of the most stressful too. And that's just kind of the double-edged sword of stress.
Yeah, and I just wanted to note too, if you guys are thinking about the nuances of these interventions, I think you'll see in our workbook, the first question we ask people in the intervention is to think back on a time where they really learned or experienced a great amount of personal or professional growth. And, so people think back to these times where they grew a lot or they performed at their highest level. And then we'll ask them, just a simple question. We'll say, hey, did that involve any stress? And invariably, everyone raises their hand, right? And it's sort of this aha moment that really contrasts exactly what you just said, this sort of zeitgeist or cultural assumption that stress is bad for you and you shouldn't have a lot of demands. And then the realization of like, oh, but wait, those times that I grew, I also was stressed, right? So it just gets people to realize that they've had moments in their lives where they grew from stress. And then what the goal of the intervention becomes is, how do you do that more often in your life? How do you make those moments more frequent because of your conscious changes in your stress mindset? And then the other nuance I wanted to mention too, that I think, as I've delivered these interventions live, the things that really gets people is when I point out that you only experience stress about things you care about. And I use the example, if Johnny was failing school, that wouldn't necessarily stress you out, unless, of course, you were Johnny,
Right.
or your Johnny was your son, or you cared really about the Johnnies of the world not failing school. So we start to realize that we only get stressed about things that matter to us, and therefore, trying to run away from stress in many ways is like pushing away the things that we really care about and the things that can really help us grow and thrive.
I just really love that point. I think that's I thought you were going to go in a slightly different direction and point out that since we only feel stress about things we care about, then we have control over whether we take on stress or not, which is true. But your emphasis really it feels like a powerful revelation. I love it.
Yeah, and I want to just clarify too, it's not knowing that we only stress about things we care about does give us control, because we can choose to care about things and embrace the stress, or we could choose to stop caring about something and let go of the stress. But I don't think it necessitates having to have control, even in situations that you can't control, like, being diagnosed with cancer, for example. Um, you don't need to necessarily have control over cancer to make it better. What you can do is realize that inherent in the stress is something you care about. So you care about your health, you care about being around for your kids, you care about living a vital life, right? And that's what's really stressing you out. It's not cancer, it's just the thought that cancer is going to get in the way of those things.
Yeah.
So when you adopt a stresses enhancing mindset, then the goal becomes, okay, how can I use this experience of stress, even though I might not be able to even cure my cancer, but how can I use it to achieve the values that I really care about? Spending more time with my family, trying to be more vital, trying to live in ways that are closer to my values. So there's a lot of nuances there, but I did want to just point out that you can adopt a stresses enhancing mindset even in situations that you can't fully control the stressor.
That's a really nice point. And what it made me think about one other sort of angle on this, and I'd love to get your reaction, and that is you can think of stress, one of the sort of benefits of stress, whether you're in control of it or not, is you can think of it as training in dealing with stress, right? Every time you face stress and take it on and engage with it, you're training yourself to do that in a more effective way.
Exactly. One of the images that we have in the intervention is this, it's a chart. You sort of see the inverted U-shaped curve that people are used to seeing around stress, that it's like stress can enhance your performance up to a point and then it debilitates your performance. And we try to point out that you get to that tipping point where it's about to start debilitating your performance, and see if you can bifurcate the curve to make a new curve so that you're now basically just in a new function, right? Where you're able to endure even more stress. And you got there not in spite of the stress, but actually because of it. And if you look back in your life, you've done this all along. I mean, going from the 5th to 6th grade, you did that, right? 6th grade was a little harder. There was a little more stress, and somehow you figured out how to endure it, learn from it, grow from it. And that made you be able to handle more stress. So we've done this in our life. It's just, how can we do it better and more deliberately? And we think that, starting by the shift in mindset is what ignites those changes.
Right. Okay, I know we need to let you go. I was going to ask you just one last question if I could, and that is whether there are ways in which you think participants in the stress can be enhancing mindset intervention often misinterpret either the overall message of the intervention or some specific component of it, and misinterpretations that can lead to the wrong message being received. And if so, are there things you say or do in interventions to guard against that, to prevent those misunderstandings?
This is so key. It's so important to really anticipate what the critiques or the misunderstandings might be, and to state them deliberately. So in every intervention we do, whether that's live or virtual, we clarify three things. First, we clarify that having a stresses enhancing mindset is not about denying the potentially debilitating effects of stress, right? We point out that it's about honoring the paradox of stress. Second, we want to point out that it's not about having to think that the stressor is a good thing, right? So having a stresses enhancing mindset doesn't mean that having cancer is a good thing, or domestic abuse is a good thing, or military trauma is a good thing, or even like being overwhelmed is a good thing, right? The stressors don't have to be good. A stresses enhancing mindset means that you can have the belief, the assumption that the experience of those stressors can lead to enhancing outcomes over time. And then third, we say this is not about seeking out unnecessary stress, right? If you live a life of value and things that you care about, there will be stress. So it's, living out of your purpose and allowing the stress to come along with those, not necessarily seeking out more stress. And it certainly doesn't license employees or governments to subject people to unnecessary stress.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Allie, for taking the time to talk with us about this and just share your thinking about the sort of behind the scenes thinking that went into all of these ideas that have been so influential and in fact have shaped my work and David's work and that of many others.
So you've heard from Allie Crum, the originator of the stress mindset intervention, and today we're going to talk about the synergistic mindset intervention, which combines the growth mindset content that you saw in another video with the stress mindset ideas that you just learned about.
That's right, and we're actually using a slightly different version of the stress mindset intervention that draws a lot of inspiration from the work of Jeremy Jameson and his colleagues. And the idea here is to weave these two distinct ideas together so that it's not just sort of two separate ideas, but rather it makes clear how these ideas work together and complement each other.
Yeah. So we're going to walk you through the kind of a bunch of the screens, but also give you a little story of how we developed it, because this was an interesting one that went through a long R&D process that involved a lot of kind of thinking through the user experience, imagining the journey that human beings go on as they experience and encounter stress. And we'll tell you a little bit about what we learned about that.
And we should say this is an intervention that David and I co-wrote with Megan Johnson, who is a creative director in our research group.
Yeah. So here's the first page. It's branded University of Texas because in our Nature paper, several of the studies were done here at UT, although we don't have that branding when we did it in the Urban Charter School or at University of Rochester. So the headline is Your Brain and Body, How They Work for You. And it tells them first who the intervention is coming from. It says, the College of Natural Sciences is developing a new program for UT students. We'd like to invite you to help improve it. This program shares scientific facts about the human brain and body during challenging periods of your life. So it's kind of a standard fare. At this point, you hopefully recognize we're telling them, who's this coming from and why. So we think it's one of the first things people ask. And then we're going to give them a preview of the key findings.
And the idea behind giving a preview of the key findings is it's helpful for people's comprehension and retention if they've got sort of a framework already in place in their minds that the details of the intervention will fit into as they encounter them.
Yeah.
Right. So it's already clear when they encounter the detailed material where it's supposed to fit into the overall picture of what we're going to tell them.
Yeah, and I think so. If you look at this page, a lesson for novice intervention writers is, if you kind of can't say your whole message in 3 bullets at the beginning, you probably have too much information for a short, under 1 hour intervention.
Yeah, or you need to spend more time sort of getting your head around the ideas you want to communicate until you are able to articulate them in simple enough terms that they could fit in about 3 bullet points. It's actually the way I think we've started writing all of our interventions, is to begin with what we call a concept kernel, which is, it's not 3 bullet points, but it's basically 1 page in which you articulate sort of the central message you want people to come away with at the end of the intervention. And it usually includes some of the language you'll weave into the full intervention. But part of the purpose of that is to make sure you're at a point where you have a clear enough understanding of what you're trying to communicate, and that message is simple enough that it can fit in a single page.
Yeah, and so Chris was just describing the concept kernel. So before we could even get to this page with the 3 bullets we're about to read to you, we had to develop that concept kernel, look at it and see, is this clear, is it linear, is it compelling? And then we actually wrote most of the intervention before we even wrote the bullets we're about to read to you. Okay, so we say, here are the 3 points. The college years are a time when experiences of difficulty, struggle, and frustration are actually important ways for your brain to learn and grow stronger. Sometimes people feel anxious or stressed when they're learning new hard things in college, but that's okay. It means your body is preparing to support your learning. People who know these facts, that the brain changes with learning, that the body mobilizes resources to support your learning, are better prepared for the difficulties of college. So those are 3 points, but actually those are 2 entire mindset messages, growth mindset and stress mindset, and an encouragement for you to use those 2 messages. So Chris, there's a lot going on even in those 3 points.
Yeah, that's right. So as David mentioned, bullet point 1 is basically a single sentence summary of a growth mindset, and with specific mention of its relevance to the college years. And the reason we're focusing on the college years is that this is a version of this intervention that we administered to UT undergraduates.
Well, so it's not just that; it's that. The primary worry about mushing together 2 interventions is it feels like Legos, like they're just 2 different things that you happen to have glued together. Mm-hmm. The way to make them synergistic is to say, you have an important goal, and here's a set of goals, and there are 2 things you need to know to achieve that goal. So the implied thing here is about how to do well during challenging periods of your life as a college student, right? There's like 2 different things you need to know. If we didn't have that goal framing, it just would feel like 2 weird facts, one about learning and one about stress.
Yeah, and actually, maybe it's worth just giving a little bit of preview of where we're going here. So the way that a growth mindset fits with the stress mindset, or at least the way we fit those 2 ideas together, is to begin by articulating the growth mindset, the idea that seeking out difficulty and challenge is a good thing, even though it feels hard. To someone who doesn't know the facts that we teach in this intervention, that feeling of difficulty can feel like a signal that you shouldn't be doing this. It doesn't feel good, right? And so we want people to understand, no, that feeling of difficulty is a good thing. That's your friend. That's telling you you're doing the things you need to do to become excellent at something, right? And then your body's stress response, we go on to explain, is one of the really powerful tools that your body gives you naturally that you can use to succeed during those periods of difficulty, right? So point number 1, difficulty is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. You want to seek it out as much as you can comfortably do that. And point number 2, your body's stress response, which people often mistake as a warning sign that they're in trouble, is actually just their bodies kicking into high gear to help them do well and overcome a difficult challenge.
Yeah. And so, it might sound like, well, that's like 2 different ideas, but the big insight, the reason why this synergistic mindset works, whereas almost no other time where people have glued together like a belonging and growth mindset or purpose and growth, there are no other examples where they've really synergistically worked together in a replicable way. The reason this works is because from the respondent's perspective, it's one thing. How do I achieve goals when things are hard? Yeah. And there's like 2 different things I need to think about, but it's one thing to them. Right. So going back to the text, We then end with this part we do all the time. If we can learn from your experiences, we can teach these powerful ideas to more students in the future. Again, the whole idea is we don't want to create the presumption that we have all this knowledge and you don't know anything and you're not good enough, and we're going to ram a bunch of neuroscience down your head. Right.
Yeah, but what we do want them to think is that we are asking you to be an active participant in this experience. You're going to teach us things even as we're teaching you things, right? So we're sort of implicitly deputizing the intervention participant as our partner, not as a passive recipient of our knowledge.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a lot on the first page, but it's pretty important to kind of understand where we're headed with that. Then again, we're using the pretty standard next page, which says who we are, how we made this intervention, and why. We say we have a kind of institutional authority. We say we made this program because many students say they're excited about coming to college, but they're stressed too. There are a lot of challenges and so on, right?
Yeah. And part of that is just validating and normalizing the feelings that every student has as they start to think about college, right? And when they begin college. It's a scary, intimidating thing, and we want to make clear to people that there's nothing wrong or weird or negative about feeling that way. That's how a person is supposed to feel when they do something big and exciting like start college.
Yeah. And then it says, this program can help future students to use the stress of college to develop powerful new skills and strengthen their brains, rather than having stress overwhelm them. So we're kind of signaling what we want people to use the information for without promising that it's going to magically do it for you, and without telling you. So we're avoiding, this is more of an avoidance thing. We don't want to be autonomy threatening and say, we're telling you how to be, and we don't want to overpromise. We don't want it to come across like we're Advil, and if you have pain, we're going to make it go away. And because then if it doesn't feel like magically they can deal with stress, which is the most likely outcome is that the changes are kind of imperceptible to the person, but detectable by us on average over time, then they're not going to reject the idea just because it doesn't work as immediately as Advil.
Right.
All right. Okay, so the first page asks them to write about a stressful experience. The main reason why we're doing this is because later in the intervention, we want to invite them to reappraise stressful things, but we found in piloting that you can't just assume people have certain stressors. It just makes a lot of presumptions about people, and you're kind of personal about that. So like, you don't want to say like, you're probably stressed about school, and people are like, wait, does that mean you think I'm an idiot, right? Or you're probably stressed about your family. I'm like, you think my family's bad? Mm-hmm. So we want them to tell us what they might be stressed about, so that they're thinking about their own stressors as they go through the treatment.
Yeah, it just, as David said, it saves us from having to make assumptions about what's stressful to them. We ask them, and then we refer to what they wrote after that.
It's kind of like taking the principles of tact and kind of building it into the intervention. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that in like a, obvious or condescending way. The reason I say that is because most informational texts aren't thought of by the authors as dyadic conversations with another person with the kind of norms of conversation. But we absolutely are thinking of this as something that's governed by like Grice's maxims and other interactional maxims. And so if you show up assuming something about somebody else, people tend to view that in the wrong way.
I really, hold on before you go forward, but I just wanted to, I really like that point that David made. I think it's a good, even setting aside the tact point, thinking of this as you write an intervention, think of yourself as being sort of subject to the normal norms of conversation. It'll help you to have a more conversational and therefore accessible tone. And it just makes it more pleasant for people to read and interact with.
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to call out something, the last thing in this prompt. It says, so actually let's just read the whole prompt. So it says, think of a time when you were working on an important assignment or test for school and you felt really stressed or anxious because you were worried you wouldn't be able to do a good job. Please choose a time when your body had a strong stress reaction. This could mean your heart was pounding, or you might have started to sweat or shake or feel out of breath, right? These are all sort of hallmark experiences of the stress response. Try to choose something you care about, because we'll come back to this example later. This might be a time when you had to give a presentation in front of people, take an important test, or complete a difficult assignment. So we're giving them some examples that are pretty common experiences that normally fit this sort of highly stressful definition. And then please explain what thoughts you were having or what your body was doing that made you realize you were stressed, right? So these instructions are, I mean, it's easy to gloss over them, but we learned to put all this sort of detail into a prompt from years of not doing it very well, right? And having people give us responses that were different from what we were looking for, right? And so now we've learned to make sure that we describe in as concrete and specific terms as possible what we want them to tell us about, in order to get useful material to work with in the rest of the intervention.
Yeah, and in this case in particular, if you talk to people about stress, they might talk about abuse or trauma or poverty, right? And those are stressors that we kind of can't do anything about in this treatment. Mm-hmm. So we need to actually narrow their construal of stress to performance situations that are choices that are plausible opportunities for using their stress.
Yep.
So that's why we're grounding them in take a test, do an assignment, give a speech.
And by the way, I'll just point out, many of you are probably noticing, this is quite different from the version of stress mindset that we discussed with Ali Crum, right? Because Ali does focus on non-controllable events, right? Things like abuse or a terrible disease diagnosis, right? Because her point is slightly different, right? Her point is even stressful experiences that are mostly awful have a positive side. You can still get benefit from just the practice in dealing with stress, right? And other benefits from overcoming stress or from dealing with it in a healthy way. Our intervention is focused specifically on the acute bodily stress response, the sympathetic nervous system activation that helps you to rise, to kick into high gear and perform at your very top level when you're facing a difficult challenge like a test or a need to give a presentation.
Yeah. And so it's not the case that there's no benefit of giving people a better appraisal of uncontrollable stressors like trauma, but we're trying to get people in acute situations to reappraise their immediate arousal in a better way. And we found during piloting that one of the biggest reasons for people to reject this message is they say, well, I've been the victim of abuse, and that's not a good thing. You can't tell me that I should do that positively.
Right, and it would have been wrong of us to try to claim that the feeling of your body's stress response in uncontrollable stress situations like abuse is a good thing that's going to help you perform at top. There's no such thing as performing well when you're subject to uncontrollable stress. Right. So we're just our intervention is aimed at a different sort of experience. The everyday, not everyday, but the regular sort of more mundane experiences of facing a difficult challenge in a domain you care about doing well in and needing to perform well when you feel nervous.
Yeah. So to summarize this section, which we clearly have a lot to say about, we are trying to prevent people's minds from going in a million directions that we can't control, so that we can very efficiently get them to think more positively about the things we can control. Okay, so then we say, let's get started. And we kind of launch into growth mindset. Notably, we decided not to copy and paste the main content from the growth mindset treatment. And that was a conscious decision, but not one we made readily. We kind of hoped initially that we could mostly copy paste because the growth mindset done in the national study was so effective. I mean, the results look amazing. Right. So, and we spent years on that. So it's a little disappointing that we couldn't do it. And yet we realized it needed to feel like one coherent message and you just had to rewrite it. So it's kind of like when you wrote a book chapter on something and later you write the article and you want to just be able to kind of, move it over or whatever, or you have a dissertation chapter and it needs to be, sometimes you just got to rewrite it.
Yeah.
And so Chris really took the lead on reimagining, and Chris, the language you used here for growth mindset was not really stuff that this wasn't canonical growth mindset,
Right.
but could you just read it and then tell me like what you were thinking when you were reframing growth mindset in this way?
Yeah, so let's just read, and this first bit is straight out of the concept kernel. This is also how the concept kernel began. So have you ever noticed that the way people talk about success and achievement can make it seem like it just comes naturally to some people? This is a problem because it makes it seem like success and achievement only come from some natural ability that a person is either born with or not. Scientists know this isn't true. The problem with believing that achievement is supposed to come easily is that it can make people miss an important insight about how you can achieve the things that matter to you. Experiences of struggle, frustration, and difficulty can be your friend, not only your enemy.
So you start with secrets of success rather than new facts about the brain. So why is this our entryway?
I wanted to capture the reader immediately by articulating something that I think a lot of people experience but might not have put their finger on, which is the way our society celebrates extraordinary success and achievement has a strong fixed mindset tone to it, right? We talk about people being geniuses or natural athletes. And not only is that an inaccurate representation of how people become outstanding, it kind of sells, well, I guess there are 3 points. The second point is it doesn't give sufficient credit to someone like Michael Jordan, who is maybe a classic example of someone who's talked about as a natural athlete. Michael Jordan was an incredibly hard-working young athlete who had to practice constantly to get as good as he was. And the same is true of almost everybody who's just sort of world-class at something. And the main reason that's important is that it makes it feel impossible to anyone who doesn't just easily and effortlessly succeed at things. It makes it feel like, what's the point of even trying, right? And that's kind of an upsetting idea, but we live with it because a lot of us have been led to believe that that's how the world is.
Yeah. So this is dispelling a common myth about success. But the reason you're doing it this way is first because it's kind of gripping and engaging to say, this is screwed up. Why are people doing this? Why are people talking this way? This is not fair. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is, conceptually, the way synergistic mindset is supposed to work is growth mindset is supposed to make you embrace the challenge, and stress mindset is supposed to make you be able to harness the stress that comes inevitably from the challenge to use it.
Right.
So we're starting with stuff that implies that people don't embrace the challenge when they have the fixed mindset view.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So step one, encourage people to embrace and take on difficult challenge. Step two, help them understand what their body's doing when they get that physiological stress response when they do take on difficult challenge.
Great. So we have a question from one of our viewers.
So a lot of interventions ask people to do one task or change a simple behavior. How does the synergistic mindset get away from people's innate distaste of doing multiple things? Because it seems like you'd have to convince people on multiple different mindsets and actions before they actually change. And that seems like a really difficult task. So how do you overcome that?
So I think the question is good because it focuses on how if you want to change behavior and you give someone a laundry list of 5 behaviors, they're like, how can I possibly change all these, right? What's nice about this is you can imagine applying to just one behavior. It's like, okay, do well on a test. But there's 2 things I need to do well on the test. I need to embrace the challenge of the test, and then while I'm stressed in that moment, embrace the stress that comes from it.
Exactly.
So it's kind of 2 ways of thinking about the same sequence of events, and that's why we think this works.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're helping to do with that question, Mac, is kind of go a little bit deeper into what it means for these two ideas to work together synergistically, right? So they both serve a single purpose, the purpose being get better at something, right? There are things you want to be better at. Step one, embrace the difficulty of taking on that challenge rather than avoiding it. And step two, when your body's stress response kicks in as you take on challenges that are hard for you, recognize that that isn't a bad sign. That's just that's your body helping you.
Yeah, but like it wouldn't work if it was, I don't know, if whenever you fail a test, study harder, and then also when you take a test, use your stress. Then it's like two behaviors, and it's too complicated. All right, so now we're using more typical growth mindset messages. So we go from we're telling you that there's a myth out there to a reason why it's a myth. But again, Chris, you kind of rewrote the canonical growth mindset messages specifically for this. So why don't you read this and tell us kind of how you frame this a little differently?
Okay, so the header is neuroscientists now understand how this works. Neuroscientists, the people who study how learning happens in the brain, know that when you're faced with difficult challenges and you keep trying until you get better, your brain grows new connections and becomes better at taking on new challenges in the future. As you do this more and more, things that used to be hard start to feel easier. And when something does feel really difficult, your brain learns how to respond more effectively to that challenge. It's a lot like the way rigorous exercise makes your muscles really sore at first, but with training, your muscles don't just get stronger, they also recover more quickly when you push them to their limit. Right? So this is doing a few things. First, the overt reference of neuroscientists is clearly meant to communicate that this is scientifically validated knowledge. This isn't just someone's opinion, right? And it uses sort of the standard the brain is like a muscle metaphor that has been part of virtually every growth mindset intervention for at least 10 or 15 years now. But it uses it in a slightly different way, a slightly more nuanced way, right? So the point isn't just your brain gets stronger, because that's actually not, the muscle metaphor isn't great for the brain, because the brain isn't getting like bigger or building more fibers the way a muscle does. Your brain is building new connections.
Right, it's like pruning, but also
Yeah.
the idea that muscles get stronger happens like, exercise is tearing muscle fibers.
Right.
And then later, then they build back up, then they get stronger. So the kind of in the moment experience of the basic muscle metaphor doesn't exactly work. And so you put an interesting twist on the muscle metaphor that fits the acute performance situation a little better.
Right. And
This last sentence here.
yeah. Right.
Yeah, makes your muscles really sore at first, but with training, your muscles don't just get stronger, they also recover more quickly when you do push them to the limit.
Right, so anyone who's had the experience of working out at the gym regularly will recognize this experience that I'm describing, which is when you first start working out, when you haven't done it in a really long time, you get really sore, and it takes 2 or 3 days before you're feel normal again and are ready to go back to the gym. But as you become a regular exerciser who strains your muscles frequently, then you're still tearing muscle fibers to make them stronger, but your muscles learn how to regenerate more quickly, right? It's less of a shock to your system when you strain it, and that's the point I'm trying to make. And the reason that was important to make that point and then validate it with a metaphor is that we wanted people to understand not only that that struggle and difficulty are their friend, but that doesn't change the fact that struggle and difficulty are unpleasant, right? There's just no getting around that. And so we also wanted them to understand that the unpleasant, difficult part of taking on challenges gets easier as you do it more.
Yeah, and so, that's a good point, that like a misuse of growth mindset is people say, mistakes are great and wonderful, they should be celebrated, and like, I made a mistake, and that's like eating ice cream. That's not people's visceral experience of like bombing something or feeling totally lost and confused. So it's a kind of more honest construal of their struggle and difficulty.
And I'll say, I think that's an especially important thing in a growth mindset intervention, because a growth mindset intervention is such a hopeful message, right? It's like suddenly you're being told, hey, you thought you were trapped being not good at things. Turns out you're not. You can get great at it. And I think one of the big dangers with these interventions is that they sound too good to be true. And so I think their credibility is enhanced the more you can accurately describe the experience of struggle and not sugarcoat anything. Just tell them what actually is good and acknowledge what's still unpleasant about taking on challenge and struggle.
Yeah. So the next page is just standard growth mindset content. There we're just giving them background. Then we're using this same metaphor, this same visual GIF from the standard growth mindset experience. But again, Chris, this is rewritten new growth mindset content that's more focused on embracing challenges. Yep. Because again, we're trying to get people to have an approach motivation for challenges so that then once they're stressed, they can reappraise their stress in a positive way. Yep. So let's read this, which we're now kind of getting towards the end of the growth mindset content and starting to raise stress. So let's read this one.
I would actually call this page sort of the crescendo of the growth mindset piece. So when people don't know this about how the brain works, they tend to avoid frustration and difficulty by not doing things that feel hard. But by avoiding difficulty, they're robbing themselves of their best opportunities to develop skills and strengths that will help them achieve the things that are important to them. Although stressful experiences feel unpleasant in the moment, they are the path through which everyone who ever became really good at something got to where they are. They are the way your neurons grow new, stronger connections that help your brain get smarter. So we're kind of returning to the sort of sentiment we opened with, right? This idea that really incredible, super high achieving people, like the very best athletes and the very best thought leaders you encounter, they're not magical better people than you. They're people who worked really, really hard for a really long time, who took on challenge and struggle more than other people chose to, and kept practicing until they became that excellent. And so if that's something you want, it's available to you. And if you if you just want to get really good, not necessarily world class, but you just want to get really good at something, you can do that too. There isn't a person who can't do that.
Yeah, and so theoretically what we're going for is just rooted in James Gross's model of appraisals, right? We think, okay, someone takes on a challenge. They give a speech for debate club, right? It feels stressful preparing and practicing, right? Okay, then they have to appraise that feeling. And how are they going to appraise it as a good thing or a sign that I'm not good enough, right? So we're really targeting appraisals here with this version of mindset in a way that in the past, it's been almost kind of more declarative knowledge, but with some implications for behaviors to take. Like it's been, the flavor of the national study is when you struggle in math, it doesn't mean you're dumb. It means you need to seek out help. It means you need to ask teachers, you need to change your study strategies. So it's like, if hard, then do these things. Here, we're focusing more on appraisals. If hard, it doesn't mean you're a nobody. It probably means you're strengthening. And it's because we're gonna launch into the reappraisal of the stress.
Yeah, it's foregrounding the appraisal piece, right? It's
not inconsistent with what we've done before, but
no.
But there'd be such a detour to be like, it's hard and you're strengthening. Oh, and by the way, you need to talk to somebody else. You need to ask for advice. If we had a million behavioral recommendations in the middle, it would really take people off track.
That's right. It comes back to Mac's point earlier that if you ask people to change 5 things about how they live their lives, that feels like a little much. But if you say, here is one, multi-step change you can make, and it offers you the promise of accomplishing the things you really care about accomplishing, that feels like an attractive proposition to people.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're kind of giving people the punchline about growth mindset. So the key point here is in bold. Difficulty, struggle, and frustration when you're learning something are not signs that you've reached your limits. They're signs that you're expanding your limits. So again, it's foregrounding the appraisal. There's the event that is difficulty or struggle or frustration, then, oh wow, how am I supposed to appraise it in the James Gross model? Like, is it a sign they've reached my limits? No, it's something else. Right. So again, we're using growth mindset mainly in an appraisal way, and that's going to set up stress mindset, which is next. And the way we transition to stress mindset is we pull a quote from Uri Treisman, who is kind of like speaking of Michael Jordan, he's like the Michael Jordan of growth mindset teaching, happens to be a professor here at the University of Texas, is a MacArthur-winning mathematician, and he naturalistically weaves together actual growth mindset language and stress mindset language in his class. And I sat in on his class, the first day of class a few years ago, along with a journalist named Paul Tough, who wrote a book where he captured this language that we heard and had a chapter about great growth mindset and stress mindset teaching. So we're like, this is totally accurate, and we were there, and this is amazing, and let's put it in. So here's what students hear from a real quote from Uri Treisman on the first day of calculus in freshman year. Everyone in this class will struggle. No matter who you are, questions are going to be flying at you that you can't understand. And when that happens, you're going to experience stress. And if you don't understand that stress, you'll think it means, oh no, I don't belong here. But in fact, that stress is an indicator that your understanding is deepening. It's not a sign you're not learning, it's a sign you are learning. So we think it's just good to have it not just be scientists, and it's coming from another source, but also it's coming from an authority figure who is the kind of person who judges and evaluates students, right? And so
there's really no more intimidating subject than calculus, I don't think. And so to hear something like that from a calculus professor, I think is especially powerful. It's worth acknowledging Uri is not trained as a social psychologist. He's just an unbelievable, intuitive social psychologist. He gets what stands in the way of people's ability to feel confident and succeed in learning. And he's really, really good at telling them what they need to know in order to get past those types of barriers.
Yeah, and that's worth saying because for other interventions that people might develop, you can find great exemplars, people who embody the message of your intervention, and just get a tape recorder and find out what they say and squeeze it in the intervention. Yeah. And in fact, in a lot of our best interventions, like the values alignment with Cameron, we found a great physics teacher and found out what he said, and then that's now copied for our intervention. That's right. So we have a question from the audience.
So I have two questions. The first is, you're talking about finding someone who embodies the message that you want to present and getting a quote from them. What is the process to doing that? Like, how do you concretely find a person and get a quote from them? And two, going back to the Uri Treisman quote, what is the most significant part of that quote that you think really points out the message of synergistic mindset?
Okay. So the first question is, how do you find an exemplar?
Yeah, I was going to say the first question really presents a nice opportunity to talk about how we begin the process of writing an intervention like this. When we're getting ready to write an intervention, the first thing we want to do is talk to lots of people who live the experience we're trying to either change or create for people. And so if we're trying to create an intervention to get more teachers to be supportive of a growth mindset, we try to find teachers who are already great at supporting a growth mindset. We find a way to measure the experiences of their students, and we find the teachers whose students say, yeah, my teacher really makes it clear that everyone in this class can succeed, and it's a matter of, that sort of thing.
So we have a closer look segment with Sergio Estrada, who is one of our bright spots. So you can do a statistical analysis to find people that, if you do a regression line of the expected performance for some leader or manager or teacher, and then their actual performance, you can find those people statistically, and then figure out what they say and what they do.
Right, and so you could do a similar thing for managers. If you were trying to do an intervention with managers, you'd first look for managers whose outcomes on the dimension you're trying to change are really extraordinary, as David just described, and talk to them.
But another thing you can do is when you talk to members of the population you're trying to work with, so if you did a focus group with college students, and they told you a story about somebody who really got this right for them, then you might go find that person. More often than not, you hear stories about people who got it totally wrong. So college students tell us about professors who made them feel like a nobody because they were struggling in school.
Yeah.
So the second question is, looking at this Treisman quote, there are two important parts. One is he's inviting students to be a little metacognitive about their stress. He said, when that happens, you're going to experience stress. If you don't understand that, you'll think it means I don't belong here. So this is kind of pulling back the veil where it's saying maybe you might have wrong appraisals and you should be open to changes. We as scientists can't say that to people because we don't have any authority. But Treisman can say that because he's seen thousands of students. So we're basically using him to tell the participant that they should rethink their appraisals. Right. And the last is just a really punchy, memorable restatement of the kind of reappraisal we want people to make.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a huge deal to get the message we're trying to articulate based on scientific research echoed in such sort of clear terms by exactly the kind of person that students are terrified of, right? A calculus professor is saying this who has taught calculus for many, many years, is saying this to his students. That has enormous credibility that we just can't muster by saying there's scientific research on this.
Yeah. Okay, so as I said, Treisman is the bridge to the stress mindset part, and that leads us now to the stress mindset, which is really the rest of the content of the treatment. So it says, why does Dr. Treisman say this? Psychophysiologists, the scientists who study the relationship between the body and the mind, now know that stress and anxiety can be a powerful tool. By the way, I always thought this was funny, Chris, because Chris did this. Mm-hmm. I've never defined certain scientific fields, but I do this all the time now that we've done this in this intervention. And I feel like by using the precise term, it's respectful to people, but by defining it, it makes it less threatening. Yeah. Anyway, it's a small thing. But then you've got this really visceral second paragraph. So you want to read this one?
Yeah, so that feeling when your heart is pounding and your palms are sweating is your body's stress response. It's your body kicking into high gear so you can do the hard work necessary to help your brain grow and strengthen connections between neurons.
Yeah, so we're now going into this visceral experience, but it's bridging from the neuroscience part. So it ends with and strengthen connections between your neurons. So it doesn't feel like we've latched on a Lego. It feels like we've just progressed to the next natural part of the argument.
This is how that happens. This is the process. We're saying taking on struggle lets your brain grow stronger by building new connections. Here's what it will look like when you do this.
Yeah. So the meta point on this one is if you're ever trying to combine two interventions, there needs to be a natural reason why you're telling people the next finding rather than the first one. And so this feels super smooth, but it didn't start this way. It took a long time to have this like totally natural thing. Yeah. This is like a really tricky part that you have to nail. Okay, so we kind of do a little bit of preview. We say basically that when you struggle, you get anxious, and we think that's bad. But in fact, it's good, and then we expand on that information. And this is where we give them some powerful mechanism evidence. And we're kind of giving them facts that help convince them that the stress-enhancing mindset is right. Yeah. But we actually return to this and have them imagine these positive things happening to them when they're stressed. So Chris, do you want to walk through this and tell me why you chose, of all the things that happen in the body that we know when people are stressed, why did we pick these and why did we say it this way?
Okay, so what's happening? Oxygen is the fuel for our brains. When your heart starts beating faster, it's delivering an extra liter of oxygenated blood to your muscles and brain each minute. This means our brains have enough fuel to work harder than normal. So the oxygen, the key to this paragraph is that your heart pounding is probably the single most noticeable symptom of sympathetic nervous system activation. It is something most people dread because they associate it with being in trouble, with being in a situation they can't totally handle. We're trying to explain what's happening there. We're telling them in accurate terms what's happening, and it makes it very plain without having to say it directly, that this is a good thing, not a bad thing. You would not want your heart not to do this if you were about to take on some difficult challenge.
So look at this. I mean, in 3 very clear sentences, we basically tell them that the most notable symptom of stress helps you meet your goals.
Yeah.
Right? Our brains have enough fuel to work harder than normal.
Okay, pumping all that extra blood to your brain and muscles means you need to breathe faster to keep that blood rich with oxygen. That's why you breathe more heavily when you're stressed. So this is important because that's probably the second most noticeable symptom of your sympathetic nervous system activation, is that feeling. It's often experienced as shortness of breath because we'll sometimes have an irregular breathing pattern. And again, we need people to understand that this is doing something useful and valuable that is helping them to perform. And in no way is this a bad thing.
Yeah. Okay, and that's next.
Okay, next, your muscles and brain both generate extra heat when they work harder, so your body begins sweating to cool your body down. Sweating allows you to keep performing at that higher level without overheating. Here, I think the main reason is that sweating is one of those embarrassing things that people worry about. They might feel a trickle of sweat run down their spine or down their neck and think, oh God, can people see that I'm sweating? This is terrible. And we just want them to understand this is a normal, natural thing and it's useful. What it's doing is supporting their body's efforts to perform at a high level in an ongoing way without having problems.
But Chris, you also did something here with these 2 paragraphs that I've never seen someone do in a reappraisal intervention, which is you connected the 3. These aren't 3 isolated symptoms.
Right.
It's like you gave it a logic, right? So what does the brain need? It needs oxygen. Well, what's that going to do? Well, first, it's going to get more blood. Okay, what's that going to do? First, it's going to need to breathe more, so it gets oxygen. Second, it's going to be warmer, so it's going to need to cool. So you made it a causal system,
right,
that and I think that's important because then it's more memorable. But also, this could be tedious information that no one wants to read.
Yeah.
But once it's like, oh wait, that's why it works, and that it's like
it all makes sense
building
together.
in curiosity, I think.
Right. Yeah. It gives you the sense of now understanding in reasonably complete terms what all this is about in your body.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you added the last thing about adrenaline, which I don't know how necessary. I think I would have been content cutting it, but you kept this. So tell me why.
So, right, and I think what you're alluding to is that unlike those previous 3 paragraphs, this is a tack on. This is just adding one extra piece. I thought it was important because people have strong positive associations with adrenaline. I think we all have an understanding that when we get adrenaline rushes, we can do things we normally couldn't do. And so I felt that it gave a real boost to the idea, it motivated this idea that this stress response is helping you perform at peak levels beyond what you would normally be capable of. So I guess the idea is the first 3 normalized things we're used to thinking of as bad, so now we understand their purpose and they're helpful, but the adrenaline piece feels almost like you're being supercharged, and the idea was to give that an association between the stress response and the notion of getting some kind of an extraordinary boost of brain power and or physical strength.
Yeah. We've also got this technical term, catecholamines, which could be a turnoff, but then it connects it with adrenaline. So I think, again, it feels like you're learning something new and technical without it being overwhelming.
And new and technical, but that fits with what you already understood, right? Everyone's heard of adrenaline. They all understand that that's a thing that helps them. And so, yeah.
So we take that information, which feels new to people. Like, of all the interventions we've done, I'd say the 2 that felt most to people like, oh my God, that's new, were the healthy eater and this one. Mm-hmm. And then we say, people don't understand this, and kind of it's wrong. Like, common wisdom is wrong, which is kind of like the way we started this intervention. So it's in keeping with the tone and tenor of everyone's wrong about success, and now we're saying everyone's wrong about stress. So we say people often mistake their body's stress response for a sign that they're in a situation they can't handle. It's easy to do, etc. There are also ways our bodies respond in emergencies when we're in real trouble. This is a mistake that can actually cause you to perform worse, because if you think your stress response is a problem, you're more likely to get worried about it and get distracted from performing. So why did you feel like we needed to say this rather than just give people the information?
people have experiences of feeling their body's stress response and messing up because of it. We needed to validate those and explain why that isn't the only possible outcome, but also explain how what we're saying up until now is not inconsistent with their experience.
Yeah, but I want to note some things we didn't do. We didn't set the wrong descriptive norm. So we didn't say everyone believes the opposite, right? We say people often mistake, right? Yeah. We also don't really accuse you of thinking the opposite.
Right.
We just say, if you think stress is a problem, then this thing could happen. Right. And the last thing is, we didn't really catastrophize. You could imagine saying, you'll get worried, you'll perform worse, then with your worst performance, your life will fall apart, then you'll be even more distressed, and think about how bad that would be. So we didn't go to that bad place. It's like we leave that unsaid, because we're about to try to get them to feel optimistic about a different way to think.
We don't want them focused on the bad things that could happen if they don't do the thing we're encouraging them to do. And then the other thing we were really careful about was not to in any way signal that there are certain types of people who think of their stress response as a bad thing. Rather, we frame it as a thought anyone can have. If they have it, it could cause problems. So just don't have it, right? Think differently.
Yeah. Okay, and then we'd have this kind of empowering turn here. We say, you are now armed with the key information you need to use your body's stress response effectively next time you feel it kicking in while you're trying to perform or master something difficult. When you start to feel anxious, try to remind yourself, this is your body's way of helping you to rise and meet the challenge you're facing. This should help you to spend less time worrying about the fact you feel so anxious, so you can focus on what you're doing and let your body's stress response give you the extra boost that you need. All right, so Chris, what's going on here?
I mean, they need a takeaway, right? So we've just given them a bunch of new information. We highlight that, and we use I like the phrase "you are now armed with." I mean, it's a weapons metaphor, but I think it's a metaphor we associate with having new capabilities or powers that we didn't used to have.
It's a respectful point that we view you as now empowered rather than so it's designed to be an asset frame rather than a deficit frame.
That's right. And then we need to very directly and clearly give them the concrete thing they can do with this information in order to use it.
Right, because this sentence in black is basically an invitation to engage in reappraisal. Right, because reappraisal is if-then problem. Like, if stressful test, then appraise it as resource, right? So here we're saying, if anxious, then make this better appraisal. Right. So that clear causal logic is important. And the last thing is we say, less time worrying about the fact that you feel anxious. Yeah. So there we're alluding to Ali Crumb's brilliant insight that people are stressed about being stressed, right? It's like, the world is so hard, I'm doing those hard things, and I'm stressed about it, and that stress is making me feel crushed, and so I feel even more guilty that I can't do anything because I'm so stressed. And that cycle of stressed about stressed is visceral and powerful, and people feel like you can't possibly get out of it. And here we're telling them, you now don't have to be stuck in that cycle. So it's paving the way for this powerful insight. Just like growth mindset comes as a relief, that you don't have to be the dumb one in school anymore. Yeah. Stress is enhancing comes as a relief because you don't have to feel crushed and overwhelmed by how stressed you are. So now it's time to start driving to action. So we've changed your beliefs. We're trying to set the stage for what you can do. And this was kind of tricky. This was one of the hardest parts. We actually had the whole kernel of the intervention that you've seen so far. And then Megan, our co-author, did a bunch of piloting, and people said, wow, great information. What am I supposed to do? And so we then just had, the way we designed what we're about to show you is we said, suppose you learn this information, what would you do differently? And we then curated examples from tons of pilot participants. And we give them 3 things that, again, came from piloting, rapid iteration piloting, kind of low res, minimum viable products. The first is, remind yourself that feelings of confusion and struggle when doing difficult schoolwork won't last forever, because as you face and work through those struggles, your brain is growing smarter. So this is an invitation to make a growth mindset reappraisal. Get the support or develop the skills that you need to be able to master your challenges, right? And then remember your body's stress response, heart beating faster, breathing more heavily, is there to help you reach peak performance when you're facing a challenge, all right? Now, critically, we would not have given this early in the intervention. It would have felt like this long list of things that people have to remember. Yeah. But now we've kind of come to the crescendo of the persuasive part, and this is like a menu of ways that you might consider acting on it.
Yeah. Key takeaways, and you get to choose among them.
Yeah. So we're not really trying to change their mindsets anymore here. This is more like a channel factor. Yeah. Right. Or like in the Lewinian, cheap meat study, like who here is willing to try meats at least once and serve it to their family? We're trying to give them a choice of a few ways of acting on this at least once after the study.
Right. So I guess one way to think about it is everything up until this point has been about informing and then building this sense of optimistic motivation. Okay, I can change things that I never thought I could change. And then this is, all right, how am I going to do it, right? Because if we had just left them at, I can change things that I never thought I could change, but didn't give them those key takeaways, those key little bits of sort of concrete instruction, then likely what would happen is that people would feel really good for a day or two until they forgot the abstract concepts or how they might fit into their lives, and we wouldn't see big changes.
Yeah. And so we have them pick these practices. They say whether they have or haven't done them before. And if they haven't done them, we ask them, what are some initial steps you could imagine yourself taking to do this during an upcoming stressful situation like the one you wrote about? So this is inspired by the logic of implementation intentions, work by Peter Gollwitzer and Gabrielle Ettingen and Katie Milkman. Yep. But it's not like a concrete action like I will go to the gym on this day. It's more like here's an appraisal or a mental simulation I'll do if a certain event happens.
Yeah, so like the previous page was here are some examples from us of concrete things you can do. The next page is, okay, you've heard what we said. Here's some more suggestions of specific things you can do. Now you make a plan that works for you. You make the plan that focuses on the aspects of this that resonated most strongly with you, that felt most useful to you. Write them down. That way you won't forget them. And in fact, your brain will automatically think of them when you're in the situation you wrote down as the kind of situation you'd want to use these in.
So that just a stylistic point here, this is a lot of content for an open-ended question. It's easy for especially low education respondents to get lost in this. So what we do is we pre-fill sentence starters in the boxes. So this is a trick that we found works especially well for teenagers. All right, so they go through a few of these. And then we're at, now again, it's just the standard toolkit. We're gonna hear descriptive norms. So normative quotes from upper year students, and then we're sliding into home, and they're gonna write their own essay that mimics these messages. So here first, again, these are all developed through pilot subjects that really were owed to Megan and her work. Here's one. I always worried I was just a bad test taker, even though my brain knew the material. When I took a test, my heart would race, my palms would sweat, I'd start breathing faster, my stomach would hurt, and then I would get low scores. I always thought that was my body telling me, stop, give up. So I was very surprised when I learned those feelings aren't always bad. They could actually be a sign my body is getting ready to overcome a challenge. After the program, I started imagining that my racing heart was just pumping blood to make it easier for my brain to put knowledge into my test score. It was a little thing, but it felt like it had a big impact. I'll never forget how I started getting scores on tests that I thought I really deserved, scores that showed what I had really learned. Now I don't see stress as a bad thing. I see it as just another thing my body does to get my brain ready to perform at its best. So it's a great takeaway of the theme, but I also want to clarify, it's within the cognitive context of goal pursuit. Right. The intentional decision we made here is to pick a kind of domain of behaviors, performance situations, especially academic ones, and then invite people to make reappraisals under those auspices.
Right. And it comes in the form of this wonderful personal transformation narrative, right? So the student begins describing a feeling lots of people have. I worried I was just a bad test taker. I had studied, I knew this stuff, I couldn't do it. Then I learned this information in the intervention, and I started having the results I had always thought I should be having. This solved a big problem for me.
But critically, it doesn't overpromise that point, right? It says it's a little thing. All they say is, I started getting scores that I thought I really deserved, right? So again, we don't want people to think of this like, I used to be in pain, and then I took Advil, and then I felt better, right? Because it's not that noticeable. And so we don't want people to give up on it just because it doesn't work like medicine.
Right, it's common to want to overpromise so that people feel as excited as you think they should be about something. But what we really try to do is just draw out what's exciting about the less sort of splashy claim, right?
Yeah.
We make a much more mundane claim, and it's still a big deal.
Yeah, it's kind of like, we don't really promise a certain result, like a certain test score, but we promise a liberation from like an oppressive idea in our culture. And that feels like a big deal to people. So here's the second one. The key thing we are doing here is we're trying to contradict the most important narrative about stress in our society, which is that you should suppress your stress, right? That stress is bad.
Or escape it. Right?
Or escape it,
Yeah.
right? So it makes sense that telling yourself don't stress doesn't work when you've chosen to do something hard but important. Instead, I can use my body's stress response to do better at the things that matter a lot to me. So we felt like this was important because with the abundance of self-care type messages in our culture, most people's view of stress is going to be that it's bad and should be avoided. And so we now that we feel like we've won people over, we don't want them to fall back into that cultural way of thinking. All right, so now we're landing the plane, and we're going to ask people to help explain this to future students. This, as you've seen in other episodes, this is the self-persuasion part, or the saying is believing, and we structure it in a way where people are reminded of the key concepts, so it's easy for them to retrieve them, but they're invited to write their own. So it says, here's where we really need your input to make the program better. Please write a personal message. First, describe a few experiences or situations where you found schoolwork challenging or stressful. Second, what could you say to help a student at UT next year who might be experiencing something similar? To understand that these challenging and stressful experiences can improve with time because your brain can learn to deal with them. For instance, you could mention, the brain forms new, stronger connections when it learns from challenges. That's the growth mindset part, obviously. And, or that the body's stress response system, your heart rate, your breathing, and so on, support the brain's learning by fueling it with the oxygen it needs to take on hard challenges. And then, as we usually do, we say we might choose some to share with students next year, and we don't want them to overthink it and monitor. We want them to just get it down, so we tell them they don't have to think about grammar.
Well, and I think that middle sentence is important too. We say, remember, the more powerful your message is, the more helpful it will be to next year's first years. So the idea here is the more vivid and powerful their message is, the more it will reinforce what they've just learned for themselves. It's also true that it will make a really compelling message that we can use in future versions of the intervention for future students. But giving it that pro-social emphasis really can be helpful in encouraging students to write as compelling and vivid a message as possible, which will only help persuade them more and reinforce the concepts more powerfully for them.
Great. So thanks for walking through this intervention with us. It was a lot of fun to write, and it's fun to revisit and share with you. We hope that this helps people understand the study, but even more so helps empower you to create versions of this for other situations. And we think this is especially important for this intervention because we have chosen to frame it around the stresses of college, but we think synergistic mindsets can work in a lot of other situations too. Performance reviews at work, or even police officers becoming better working on the streets, and so on. So we hope that those of you seeing this, take it, adapt it, and make it better to solve other problems as well. Thanks for joining A Closer Look.
All right.